My name is Maren Brandt, and at 34, I sat in the back row of my own family's celebration and watched my brother raise a glass to a company he was about to sell for $19 million. A company built on a cheese I created, a cheese the buyers had flown in from Chicago to taste, praise, and purchase. My mother stood beside him in a dress that cost more than my first car, smiling at a room full of strangers, and when a reporter from the trade magazine asked her who developed the famous Driftless Reserve, she put her hand on my brother's shoulder and said, "Oh, Holt built all of this." I was 11 feet away. I had the original culture formula in my coat pocket, handwritten, in a notebook with my grandfather's coffee stains on the cover. And buried 3 pages deep in the purchase agreement nobody had let me read was a single clause that meant the sale could not legally happen without my signature. They thought the worst thing that could happen to me that night was being ignored at a party. They had no idea I was the party. Welcome back to the channel where the quiet ones finally stop explaining themselves and let the paperwork talk. If you have ever watched someone else take a bow for the thing you built with your own 2 hands, this story is for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because what happened at that signing table is something the Brandt family is still arguing about. Let me take you back to the morning it started, 3 weeks before the party, when my mother called me at 6 in the morning to tell me what I was and was not allowed to say. I live in a converted dairy barn outside a town called Monroe, in Greene County, Wisconsin, which is the kind of place where the cheese is older news than the weather. I have a lab in what used to be the milk house. A small one, 2 stainless tables, an incubator, a microscope my grandfather bought me when I was 22, and a wall of glass jars holding cultures I have spent 12 years coaxing into being. People drive past my barn and think I grow vegetables. What I actually grow is bacteria, specific bacteria, the kind that turns ordinary milk into something people will wait 18 months and pay $40 a pound to eat. I'm a food scientist. That is the part of the sentence my family always let trail off, the way you let a sneeze trail off when you decide it isn't coming. My mother told people I worked with cheese, which made it sound like I stocked a deli case. My brother told people I helped out at the creamery. Both of those were technically a kind of true and entirely a lie, and I had stopped correcting either of them somewhere around my 28th birthday. There is a particular silence that grows in a family when one child learns that explaining herself only invites a smaller version of the truth in return. I had gone quiet inside that silence and built a life I never described to them, because describing it had never once made it more real to them. It only gave them something to shrink. So when my phone lit up at 6 in the morning with the word mom on the screen, I almost let it ring out. I was already awake. I was already in the milk house in a wool sweater with a notebook open, checking a batch of wash cultures that had come up cloudy overnight. I picked up on the 3rd ring anyway. I always do. That is its own kind of answer. She did not say hello. My mother has not opened a phone call with hello in my lifetime. She said, "The buyers are coming the week of the 20th, and there's going to be a celebration, and I need you to understand something before you embarrass us." I set down my pencil. Outside the milkhouse window, the fog was sitting low over the back pasture, the way it does in October, and somewhere a Holstein was complaining about the hour. "Embarrass who?" I said. "Maren." She said my name the way she always did, like a small repair. This is the biggest thing that has ever happened to this family. Cardinal Provisions does not buy regional creameries. They are buying ours. There will be press. There will be people who matter. And I need you to come and smile and not get into one of your moods about the science. My moods about the science? You know what I mean. A pause, and then the thing she had actually called to say, the thing she had rehearsed, because my mother rehearses cruelty the way other women rehearse a toast. "Holt and your father have worked their whole lives for this. Don't make it about your little science project." There it was, my little science project. The phrase she had been using since I was 14 years old and brought home a ribbon from a state competition for isolating a bacterial strain from raw milk. She had said it then with a kind of bafflement, the way you'd describe a cat that learned to open doors. She had said it every year since, sanding it smoother each time, until it fit in her mouth like a worn stone. Don't make it about your little science project. As if Driftless Reserve, the cheese on the front of every magazine that had ever written about us, the cheese that was the entire reason a company called Cardinal Provisions was flying into Madison with a checkbook, had been a hobby I'd done in a corner while the real work happened somewhere else. I did not argue. You cannot argue someone out of a story they have spent 20 years telling to make themselves comfortable. I said, "What time should I be there?" She paused, thrown, because a fight was what she had braced for, and a fight is the only conversation my mother knows how to win. She recovered and told me the date and the dress code and hung up first, the way she always hangs up first. I sat in the milk house with the cold coming up through the concrete floor and the fog at the window, and I thought about that phrase, my little science project, And I thought about the buyers. And I thought about a clause I had signed when I was 26 years old that nobody in my family had read then, and nobody had thought to read since. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel small. I felt very calm, the way the lab goes quiet when a culture finally takes. And before any test confirms it, that the thing you have been waiting on for months has just woken up. To understand why that phone call did not break me, you have to understand the cave. My grandfather, Otto Brandt, dug a cheese cave into the side of a hill behind the creamery in 1961 with a borrowed backhoe and an argument with the county. People thought he was crazy. Wisconsin had 1,000 cheesemakers, and most of them made the same 6 cheeses, the yellow ones, the ones that go on a burger. Otto wanted to make the cheeses he remembered from the old country, the wash-dried ones, the ones that smell like a barn and taste like something you'd remember on your last day. He wanted them aged in stone and humidity and patience, not in a refrigerated warehouse. So he dug a cave. For 30 years that cave made him a modest living and a local reputation. Brandt Family Creamery, a good name in Greene County and almost nowhere else. My father, Gerald, took over the business side in the 90s, and my father is a man who is very good at standing next to things that other people built. He wore the title of president the way some men wear a watch their father left them. Proud of it, careful with it, never once thinking about what was inside the case. I was the only grandchild who liked the cave. My brother Holt is 3 years older than me and was, from the time he could walk, the answer to a question my parents had been asking before either of us was born. He was the boy. He was the one who looked good in the Christmas photo, the one who could talk to the bankers, the one my mother arranged her whole self around the way you arrange a room around a fireplace. I do not say that with bitterness. You cannot be bitter at someone for being warm. I say it because it is the architecture of the thing, and the architecture matters. Holt was the center, and centers do not have to earn their place. The rest of us did. I earned mine in the cave because that was the one room in my family where nobody else wanted to be. It smelled. It was cold. The work was slow and strange, and you couldn't show it off. My grandfather would be down there at 5 in the morning turning wheels and washing rinds with a brine-soaked cloth, and I would sit on an upturned crate with a flashlight and watch him, and he would talk to me the way he never talked to anyone in the house. He would say, "The cheese tells you what it wants, you just have to learn the language." He would say, "Anybody can follow a recipe. The trick is knowing why it works, because the day the recipe fails is the day you find out who actually understands it." He kept a book, a leather make book, the kind cheesemakers have kept for 200 years, with the date and the milk and the temperature and the cultures, and a column on the right for notes. His handwriting was small and slanted and full of misspellings, because he'd left school at 13, and his notes were the most honest writing I have ever read. "Batch sour, my fault, rush the set. Good wheel today, don't know why, pay attention next time." That book taught me that the difference between a craftsman and an amateur is not talent. It is the willingness to write down your own mistakes where you'll have to see them again. When I was 16, I told my mother I wanted to study food science. She made the face she makes, the one that isn't anger, it's something worse, a kind of polite confusion, as if I'd announced I wanted to be a weather balloon. My father said it sounded expensive. My grandfather drove me 4 hours to the university himself, in the creamery truck that smelled like brine, and sat in the admissions office in his good flannel with his hat in his hands. And when the woman asked who would be supporting my studies, he said, "I will, and she's worth it, so write that down." He paid for 4 years out of a creamery that barely cleared a living. He never told my parents the number. I found out later it was most of what he had. I tell you this so you understand something before we go any further. I did not grow up the bitter sister sharpening a knife. I grew up the lucky one, because one person in that family saw exactly who I was and bet everything he had on it. The bitterness, if you want to call it that, came later, and it came from a very specific place. It came from watching the thing he and I built together get handed, year after year, to the one person in the family who had never once gone down into the cave. I came home from graduate school at 25 with a master's degree, a head full of microbiology, and a problem to solve. Otto was 78 by then, and his hands had started to shake, and the cave was struggling. His wash-dried cheeses were inconsistent. One batch would be perfect, and the next would be flat or harsh or would crack in the cave, and he couldn't tell me why, because the why had finally outrun the language he'd taught himself. The recipe had started to fail, and just like he'd promised me 20 years before, that was the day we found out who actually understood it. I understood it. I spent 8 months in the milk house with a microscope and that incubator and a freezer full of milk samples. The problem was the cultures. For 60 years, Brandt Family Creamery had been buying its bacterial cultures the way everyone does, from a catalog, freeze-dried, generic, the same strains 100 other creameries used. Those strains were fine for the yellow cheeses. They were not fine for what Otto was trying to do in the cave, because the magic of a wash-dried cheese is in the secondary cultures, the wild-tasting ones that grow on the surface and ripen the cheese from the outside in, and the catalog strains were too tame and too inconsistent to do it right. So I built our own. I isolated strains from the cave itself, from the old wood shelves, from the brine barrel my grandfather had been topping up for 40 years, from the rind of the one wheel in 100 that came out perfect. I screened them. I grew them. I tested combinations the way you test keys against a lock, hundreds of them, and I wrote down every failure in the same makebook my grandfather had started, in the same column on the right, in handwriting that got smaller and more careful as the months went on. And on a Tuesday in March, 8 months in, I opened the incubator and found a culture blend that did the thing I had been chasing. A starter and a wash culture, balanced, stable, repeatable, that turned our milk into a cheese neither Otto nor anyone else had ever tasted before. We named it Driftless Reserve, after the unglaciated hill country we live in, the part of Wisconsin the Ice Age forgot. We entered it in the American Cheese Society competition the next year, and it won Best in Show. The year after that, a magazine put it on the cover. The year after that, we couldn't make enough of it, and Brandt Family Creamery stopped being a good name in Greene County and started being a good name everywhere. And my father started wearing better suits. And my brother got an MBA and came home to run the business. And somewhere in there, without anyone deciding it out loud, the story of where Driftless Reserve came from got quietly revised. It became Holt's cheese, not in those words. Nobody ever stood up and said Holt invented it. It was subtler than that, and subtler is harder to fight. Holt gave the interviews because Holt was good at interviews. Holt stood next to the cheese in the photos because Holt looked right next to things. When a writer asked about the famous cultures, Holt would say our proprietary process and what we've developed here, and we did a quiet, dishonest amount of work, and I was usually in the milk house when the writer came through, because someone had to actually make the cultures, and that someone was never invited to lunch. I let it happen. I want to be honest about that because some of you are sitting there wanting to shake me, and you're right too. I let it happen for years. I told myself the work was the reward, that I didn't need my name on the magazine, that the cheese knew who made it even if the family didn't. That was half true and half cowardice, and the cowardice was this. In my family, claiming credit was the fastest way to get the credit taken from you. The moment you said, "I did that," my mother heard, "she's making it about herself," and the punishment for making it about yourself was a fresh coat of that phrase. Her little science project. So I stayed quiet, and I made the cheese, and I let the story belong to whoever the family needed it to belong to. But I did one thing. One careful, quiet, almost accidental thing, 8 years before any of this, that turned out to be the entire game. I licensed the cultures instead of giving them away. It happened because of Otto, and it happened because Otto, even at 78 with shaking hands, understood my family better than I did. When I built the Driftless Reserve cultures, I was not an employee of the creamery. Think about that, because the family never did. I had just finished graduate school. I had student loans. I did the development work as an independent contractor, on a handshake, the way families do everything, sloppily and with love, and with no idea they are building a fault line. My grandfather paid me a small monthly fee out of his own pocket to keep me going while I worked. There was no employment contract. There was no agreement that the cultures I developed belonged to the company. Under the law, the work an independent contractor creates belongs to the contractor unless she signs it away. Nobody signed anything, because nobody in my family reads anything, because reading things is what lawyers are for, and lawyers are what other people are for. When the cheese took off, my grandfather did something that surprised me. He sat me down in the cave on the crates, the two of us, and he said, "We need to put this in writing, the culture's what's yours." I said, "Grandpa, it's the family company, it doesn't matter." And he said the thing I have thought about every day since. He said, "It matters because it's the family company. You think your brother is going to remember who made this? You think your mother is? When there's money in it, they will remember it however makes the money theirs. I've watched them my whole life. The only thing they respect is a thing they can't argue with. So we're going to write something they can't argue with." He had a lawyer, not a family lawyer, his own, an old man in Monroe who had done his will and his land. The two of them, two stubborn old men, drew up a license agreement in 2014, and I signed it. And Otto signed it on behalf of the creamery as president emeritus, which he still technically was, and my father signed it too, because my father signs where he is pointed, and he was pointed at it on a busy afternoon and told it was just protecting the recipe. He never read past the first paragraph. I know that for a fact because I watched him. Here is what the agreement said in the plain version. The proprietary Driftless Reserve culture blend and the affinage process built around it were my intellectual property. Brandt Family Creamery had a license to use them. The license was generous. It cost the company almost nothing, but it had two teeth in it, and Otto put both teeth in on purpose. First, the license was non-assignable, which means the company could not transfer it to anyone else, could not sell it, could not hand it to a new owner without my written consent. And second, it was terminable, which means if the company breached the agreement, I could end it. And the day I ended it, every wheel of Driftless Reserve in production became a cheese. The company no longer had the legal right to make or sell under that name and process. Otto folded the signed copy into his makebook, the leather one, between the last page of his handwriting and the back cover, and he handed me the book and said, "Keep this where they won't think to look. The day they forget you made it is the day you'll need it." He died the next winter. Pneumonia, fast, the way it takes old men who have spent their lives in cold rooms. The funeral was large because the town loved him. My mother gave a beautiful eulogy about a man she had spent 30 years finding embarrassing. My brother spoke about carrying on the family legacy. I did not speak because I could not have gotten through it, and because nobody asked me to. I took the make-book home. I put it in a drawer in the milk house, wrapped in a clean cloth, the way you'd wrap something that was once alive. And for 8 years, I almost forgot it was there. Because for 8 years, nobody needed reminding who made the cheese, since there was no money in remembering and no money in forgetting either. Then Cardinal Provisions called, and there was 19 million reasons to forget. And my grandfather, 4 years in the ground, turned out to be the smartest man any of us had ever known. I found out about the sale the way I find out about everything in my family, late, sideways, and by accident. It was my sister Margaret who told me, and she didn't mean to. Margaret is 2 years younger than me, and she does the marketing for the creamery, which mostly means she is good at the part of the family approves of, the part that smiles in photographs and posts pretty pictures of cheese boards. Margaret and I are not close, but we are not enemies. We are two women who grew up in the same house and learned different survival strategies. Mine was to leave the room, hers was to please everyone in it, and you cannot fully blame a person for the shape the pressure pressed them into. She called me about something else, a label question, and at the end she said, without thinking, "Oh, you'll hear all about it at the cardinal thing anyway." And I said, "What cardinal thing?" And there was a silence on the line that told me she had stepped on something she'd been told not to step on. It came out in pieces, the way these things do when someone is trying to take back what they've already said. Cardinal Provisions, a specialty food group out of Chicago, the kind that buys up beloved regional brands and scales them into grocery stores nationwide, had been in talks with my father and Holt for 4 months. 4 months. The deal was nearly done. $19 million for the brand, the recipes, the cave, the name, everything. There was going to be a closing celebration at the country club in 3 weeks, the buyers flying in, the press invited, the whole county watching the little creamery from the Driftless become a national name. "And what's my part in it?" I asked, keeping my voice level, the voice I use when a batch has gone wrong and panicking won't fix it. Margaret hesitated. "I mean, you'll be there as family." "As family?" "Maren, don't. Holt's worked really hard on this. The diligent stuff, the lawyers, it's been insane. Just can it not be a thing this time? Can it not be a thing?" There is a whole philosophy of my family in those 4 words. The thing was never the lie. The thing was me noticing the lie. The noticing was the rudeness. The noticing was what made me difficult. I told her I had to go. I did not yell. I have learned that raising your voice with people who have already decided you're the problem only hands them the proof. I hung up and I sat in the milk house and I did the math. 4 months of due diligence. That means lawyers. That means Cardinal's lawyers. They had parsed every contract, every lease, every disclosure, and they had found the 2014 agreement. They knew exactly what it meant. They knew that without my signature, the $19 million deal was a house of cards. And yet, nobody had called me. Nobody had mentioned it. They were just going to coast through the gala, announce the acquisition, and figure out how to force my hand later. Or maybe they thought I wouldn't notice. Or maybe they thought the sheer pressure of a room full of people celebrating would be enough to make me sign whatever they put in front of me. I stood up and I went back to work. I had a batch of starter cultures to check, but my hands were steady now. The knot in my stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. My family had spent 10 years treating me like an extra in their story. They were about to find out I owned the script. The country club outside Monroe is not a fancy place by the standards of a city, but it is the fanciest place my county has. And my mother had been waiting her whole life for a reason to own a room in it. She had the reason now, 19 million of them. I drove out on a cold, clear Friday in October with the makebook in a flat leather folio on the passenger seat, the license inside, the article inside, my grandfather's handwriting inside. I wore a dark green dress, simple, nothing that asked for attention, because the attention was not going to come from the dress. I had thought about what to wear for a long time, and in the end I dressed the way I'd dressed to present a finding, calm, clean, unremarkable, The way you dress when the thing you're carrying is loud enough that you don't need to be. The room was full. 150 people, maybe more. The whole county in its good clothes. Long tables, a bar, a banner that read celebrating the future of Brandt family creamery. And on every table, a board of our cheeses, the reserve in the center of each one. The cheese I made, sliced and fanned and gorgeous under the warm light. There was a small stage at the front with a podium and a long table beside it. And on the long table, a leather portfolio and a heavy pen, the closing documents, the ceremony of the signing, because my mother does not let a transaction happen when it can happen as a performance instead. The cardinal people stood near the front. I picked them out immediately, the way you pick out the one sober person at a wedding. 3 of them. An older man with silver hair and the easy stillness of someone who signs large checks, who I would learn was Theo Halden, the principal, the man whose name was on the building in Chicago, a younger man with a tablet, and a woman, maybe 50, in a charcoal suit, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and a folder under her arm, watching the room the way I watch a culture under glass, patient, attentive, missing nothing. That was Priya Anand. She was Cardinal's lead negotiator, the one who had run the 4 months of diligence, the one who had read every contract Brandt family creamery had ever signed. She did not look like a woman about to be surprised. She looked like a woman who already knew something the rest of the room didn't, and was waiting with great professional patience to see whether anyone else in the family knew it too. My mother found me at the door. She looked me over, the green dress, the folio under my arm, and decided I was harmless, which is a mistake she has made my entire life. "Oh, good you came," she said, the way you'd greet a caterer. "Sit anywhere, we're starting soon." And Maren, her hand on my arm, her voice dropping into the register she uses for instructions. "Please, just let your brother have this. Don't make tonight about your little science project. 4 times now." She said it like a benediction. She had no idea she was handing me the room. I found a seat at a side table, not in the front, where they'd put the family, but off to the side where I could see the stage and the cardinal people and the door. Booker was already there, in his good shirt, in the back, a mountain of a man holding a glass of beer he wasn't drinking, and he caught my eye and gave me one slow nod. Margaret was at the family table looking faintly sick. My father sat at the head of it in a new suit, proud and hollow, glancing up at the chandelier every few minutes like he was worried it might fall. The program started. My mother took the podium first and gave a speech about family and legacy and the future, and she was, I'll give her this, a performer to the bone, the kind of speaker who can fill a whole room and leave no air in it for the truth. She talked about my grandfather. She talked about Holt. She talked about our team, and what we built, and the recipe that's been in our family for generations, which was a lie so clean and so total that I almost admired it, because the recipe was not generations old, it was 12 years old, and it had been built by the daughter sitting at the side table she did not gesture toward. Then she introduced Holt, the man who turned his grandfather's dream into a national treasure, and Holt took the podium to applause, and he gave the buyers a smile, and he told the story of Driftless Reserve. He told it well. He told it like a man who'd been telling it for years, which he had. He talked about innovation and process and what we developed here. He held up a wedge of the reserve and the room sighed at it, and he said, "This cheese is the heart of everything we are," and he was right about that. He just had the wrong heart. And then he turned to the cardinal people and said the line my mother had clearly fed him, the line designed to make the whole thing land, and he said, "And tonight, we trust the future of this family's life's work to partners who understand what it means." The cardinal principal, Theo Halden, smiled and nodded. Priya Anand did not. Priya Anand looked for one quick second across the room directly at me. She had a folder under her arm. She knew, of course she knew. She'd read the agreement 4 months ago. She'd been waiting this whole time to see how the family planned to handle the one fact that could unravel everything. And the family's plan, she now understood, was to pretend it wasn't true and hope the daughter signed where she was pointed. My brother set down the wedge of cheese. My mother stepped forward, beaming, and gestured to the long table with the leather portfolio. "And now," she said, "the moment we've all been waiting for, the signing." And my father stood up, and Holt stood beside him, and a hush came over the room, and somebody handed my father the heavy pen, and I picked up my folio and I stood up from the side table, and I started walking toward the front, unhurried, the way you walk when you are the only person in the room who knows what is about to happen. My mother saw me first. Her face did the thing it does, the smile staying fixed while the eyes recalculate. "Maren," she said into the microphone, turning my name into a small public joke, "always likes to be in the middle of things." A scattering of polite laughter. She thought she was managing me. She was handing me the floor. I stopped a few feet from the long table where the family stood, where the pen waited, where the cardinal people could see me and the room could hear me. I did not reach for the microphone. I have never needed to be the loudest thing in a room. I have spent my life being the most certain thing in it, which is different and quieter and wins. Before anyone signs anything, I said, and the room, which had been warm and loose and a little drunk, went still in that particular way a room goes still when it realizes the script has changed. I think the people buying this company deserve to know exactly what they're buying. And I think this county, which has loved Brandt Family Creamery for 60 years, deserves to hear the truth about it. It'll only take a minute, then you can sign. Maren. My father, a warning, the first word he'd said to me directly in months. My name is Maren Brandt, I said to the room, to the buyers, to the press in the corner. Otto Brandt was my grandfather. He dug that cave behind the creamery in 1961, and he taught me everything I know, and the last big thing he ever did was make sure his family couldn't do exactly what they're trying to do tonight. I opened the folio. I did not wave it. I held it the way you hold a finding you are certain of, flat, calm, unremarkable. Driftless Reserve, the cheese on every one of these tables. The cheese that is the reason Cardinal Provisions flew here from Chicago. The cheese that turned a $2 million creamery into a $19 million one was developed by me, not by our team. Not by a recipe passed down for generations. By me over 8 months in the milk house when I was 25, out of cultures I isolated from my grandfather's cave, paid for with the last of his savings. I have the development notes. I have my grandfather's makebook with the work in his hand and mine. I held up the leather book, Otto's coffee stain facing the room. And I have something else. I took out the 2014 license agreement and laid it on the long table, next to the leather portfolio, next to the heavy pen, where the family stood and the buyers could see. This is a license agreement, signed in 2014. It says the proprietary Driftless Reserve cultures and process are my intellectual property, not the company's. The company has a license to use them. And that license, I looked at Holt, who had gone the color of the tablecloth, cannot be sold, transferred, or assigned to a buyer without my written consent, which means the asset that the entire $19 million deal depends on does not belong to the people standing at this table. It belongs to the woman my mother just introduced as someone who likes to be in the middle of things. The room did not gasp. It went tight and quiet all at once. I watched it go through them in waves. The county people doing the math, the press in the corner suddenly upright, my father staring at the document with his name on it, the document he'd signed 8 years ago on a busy afternoon and never read. Holt found his voice first, and he reached for the only tool he'd ever needed, the family liturgy, and he set it into the live microphone in front of 150 people and the buyers and the press. He laughed, the practiced laugh, and he said, "Folks, I'm sorry, my sister has always had a flair for the dramatic. This is a misunderstanding. The cheese is the family's. This is just Maren's little science project, and she's blowing it way out of proportion. Mr. Brandt." The voice came from the front. Calm, clear, carrying. Priya Anand had stepped forward, the folder open in her hands, the reading glasses now down on her nose. The whole room turned to her because she was cardinal. She was the money. She was the only person there with the authority to say what was true and have it count. "I'm going to stop you there," she said to Holt, not unkindly, the way you'd stop a man before he walked off a ledge. "Because I've read this agreement. My team flagged it in the first month of diligence. I've raised it with your counsel 4 separate times." She looked at my father, and her voice was even and almost gentle, which made it worse. "Mr. Brandt, we told your lawyers repeatedly that this deal cannot close without the consent of the license holder. We were assured repeatedly that the license holder was family, that it was handled, that she would sign. We were told not to worry about it." She turned and looked at me, and something passed between us, the recognition of one careful person for another. "What no one at Cardinal could understand," Priya said, "and what I've been trying to figure out for 4 months is why a company would build its entire valuation on a cheese and then treat the person who owns that cheese as if she were a formality." She closed the folder. "Now I understand. They didn't think she'd read the contract. Because they never did." The silence after that was total. My mother had gone white. My father sat down, slowly, in a chair that wasn't his, holding the license he'd signed without reading it now, for the first time, far too late. And Holt stood at the podium with the dead microphone in his hand and the practiced laugh dead in his throat. "That's not," he started and stopped. "She's family. We were going to take care of her. There's a number in the deal for her, 40 grand. Holt," it was Booker. The big man had stood up in the back, 71 years old, 43 years in that creamery, and the room turned to him because a voice like that, when it finally speaks, you turn. He walked up the side of the room, unhurried, a mountain in a good shirt, and he stood near the front and he looked at the buyers and the press and the county, and he said, "I made cheese alongside Otto Brandt for 30 years and alongside this girl for 10. I was there the morning she cracked the reserve cultures. I watched her do it. The old man watched her do it. Holt was getting his business degree in Madison. He looked at Holt and there was no cruelty in it, which made it land harder. Son, you're a fine salesman, but you never once made a wheel of that cheese in your life, and your grandfather asked me before he died to say so out loud if it ever came to this. So I'm saying it. The reserve is hers, always was. Nobody in that room moved. The county people who had clapped for my mother's speech 20 minutes earlier were looking at my brother and my mother and my father now. And the looking was the kind that does not unlook itself. And my mother, standing in the room she had waited her whole life to own, finally understood that she had arranged this entire evening herself. The room, the audience, the stage, and then handed it, without ever meaning to the one person in the family with a true thing left to say. The crowd she had gathered to witness her triumph was witnessing something else now. I'd be lying if I told you the next part felt like victory, because that is not how it went, and you've trusted me this far, so I won't start lying now. Theo Haldon, the cardinal principal, the silver-haired man who'd been smiling all night, was not smiling anymore, but he was not angry either. He was something more useful than angry. He was a man recalculating in real time, the way men who sign large checks learn to do, and he was looking at me, not at Holt, not at my father, at me, with an expression I recognized because it was the same one Priya had worn all night. Reappraisal. The look of someone who has just realized the value in the room is not standing where the sign said it would be. He came over to me while the room was still churning, while my mother was hissing at Holt and my father was sitting in his borrowed chair, and Theo Haldon put out his hand and said, quietly just to me, Ms. Brandt, it seems we've been negotiating with the wrong people. I shook his hand. It seems you have. Priya warned me, he said with a small, dry, honest smile. 2 months ago. She said, the value in that company isn't in the office. It's in the milk house, and nobody's let us talk to her. I should have listened to her sooner. He glanced back at the long table, the leather portfolio, the unsigned documents, my father holding the license like a man holding a diagnosis. We flew here to buy a cheese. The cheese is yours, so I'd like to start over with you if you'll have a conversation with us. Not tonight. Tonight's a mess, and that's not your fault. He paused. Although from where I'm standing, it looks like it's nobody's fault but the people who tried to sell something that wasn't theirs. Here is the part where the old me, the milkhouse me, the one who'd swallowed the phrase for 20 years, would have rushed to fix it, would have said something soft to make the room comfortable, would have found a way to give the family the deal back, would have spent herself down to nothing buying peace at a table that never set a place for her. I felt the pull of it. 20 years of pull. I looked at Theo Haldon, and I looked past him at my family, at my mother's white face and my father in the wrong chair and my brother with the dead microphone, and I looked at Booker, and at Priya, and at the make book in my hands with my grandfather's coffee stain on the cover. And I said, I'll have the conversation, but it's going to be a different conversation than the one you flew here for. I'm not interested in licensing my work to people who'll put it in a plastic clamshell in a grocery cooler. My grandfather aged that cheese in stone because some things are worth waiting for. If Cardinal wants Driftless Reserve, Cardinal wants me, and it wants the cave, and it wants Booker, and it wants things done the right way, slow, the way they were built. That's the only version of this that exists. Theo Haldon looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real one this time, the smile of a man who has just found the thing he didn't know he was looking for. Now that, he said, is a conversation worth having. The deal that Cardinal Provisions eventually made was not the deal that walked into that country club. It took months. Priya and ran it, and somewhere in those months Priya stopped being the buyer's negotiator and started being something closer to an ally, because she was the only person in the whole affair who had seen me clearly from the start, who had read the contract and understood that the woman in the milk house was the entire company, and had spent 4 months frustrated that no one would let her in the room. We worked well together. Careful people usually do. The new structure was clean. Cardinal did not buy Brandt Family Creamery the way they'd planned. The brand stripped out and scaled into a national grocery line, with my family pocketing $19 million. They couldn't because they couldn't have the cheese without me, and I would not assign the license into a deal built to industrialize the thing my grandfather dug a cave to protect. Instead, Cardinal invested. They put capital into the creamery, real money, but as a minority partner, not an owner. The cultures and the process stayed licensed from me, on new terms I wrote, terms that paid me what the work was actually worth instead of $40,000, and the word generous. And the operating control, the decisions about how Driftless Reserve got made and aged and sold, came to me. Cardinal wanted it that way. Theo Haldon said it plainly in the second meeting. We're not buying a factory. We're buying the reason the factory matters, that's you. So you run the part that matters. I run the cave now. I did not set out to take anything from my family. I want that on the record because I know the story they tell, and in their story, I am the daughter who waited in the wings with a contract and torched a generational fortune out of jealousy. But that story requires you to forget that they were the ones selling something that wasn't theirs, that they were warned 4 times by the buyers and chose not to hear it, that I offered them the truth as the entire price of my signature, and they decided the truth about me was too expensive to say out loud. I did not take the company. They tried to sell mine, and I declined to let them, and everything after that was just the consequence of a thing they set in motion the day they decided I was a little science project instead of the scientist. The fallout came in pieces over the next year. Holt resigned. He had to. He had stood at a podium in front of the county and the press and claimed a thing that the buyers themselves then said was not his. And there is no coming back from that in a town this size, where everyone knows everyone and the story travels faster than the truck. He is selling commercial real estate now, 2 counties over. Bryn, his wife, did not leave him, which I think speaks well of her, but the marriage got quieter in a way Margaret tells me about sometimes. He has not apologized to me. I did not expect him to. The hardest thing for a man who built his whole self on a story is to admit the story was never his, and some men sit in that bunker the rest of their lives. My father is the one I think about most. He sat in that wrong chair, holding a license he'd signed without reading, and I watched something break in him that night that wasn't about the money. My father had spent 40 years being very good at standing next to things other people built, and that night, in front of everyone, the standing next to finally got named for what it was. He came out to the milk house a few weeks later alone, which he had not done in years. He stood in the doorway in his coat, and he looked at the incubator and the jars and the microscope my grandfather bought me, and he said, "I never came out here your whole life. I never once came out here to see what you were doing." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was closer to a man reading a document he should have read a long time ago. I told him the door was open. I meant it. He comes out sometimes now, on Sunday mornings, and sits on a crate and watches me work and doesn't say much, the way Otto used to. It is not the father I wanted at 20. It is the father I have at 34, and I have decided that an honest late thing is worth more than a comfortable lie, which is a thing it took me my whole life to learn. My mother and I do not speak much. She told the church I had betrayed the family, and then the deal closed and the creamery thrived, and the checks came, and the betrayal got quieter, the way betrayals always do when they turn out to have been the thing that saved everyone. She has never once said the phrase to me again. Her little science project died in that country club, on the live microphone, the night she handed it to me as a warning and I handed it back as a verdict. I do not think she has forgiven me for being right. That's all right. I have stopped needing my mother to forgive me for things that were never wrong. Margaret is the surprise. My sister, who spent her whole life pleasing the room, came out to the cave a month after the party, and she stood there in her nice coat in the cold and she said, "I knew. I think I always knew you made it. It was easier not to say anything." She started to cry, the way you cry when you finally set something down. "I'm sorry, Maren. I should have said something years ago." She does the marketing for the creamery still, but she does it differently now. The new labels, the new story Cardinal helped us write, they tell the truth. There is a line on the back of every wheel of Driftless Reserve now, developed by Maren Brandt in the Brandt family cave, from cultures of the Driftless, the way her grandfather taught her. Margaret wrote that line herself. She did not have to. It is the closest thing to an apology my family has managed, and I took it because it was real. Booker runs the make room. I made sure of it first thing, before I signed anything. The man who'd been pushed toward the door for 10 years got walked back to the center of the room, and on his first day back he stood in the make room with his hand on the vat and he didn't say anything. He just stood there, and I let him, because some conversations happen in the quiet after the words run out. A year after the party, we had the harvest dinner in the cave. It's a thing Otto used to do, before the money, before any of it, a long table down the center of the cave under the wheels of aging cheese, the whole crew, the families, beer and bread, and the reserve cut thick. Holt had ended it years ago because it wasn't scalable. I brought it back the first autumn I ran the place. The table was full. Booker at one end, the make room crew. Priya drove up from Chicago because she'd become, somewhere in all of it, a friend. Margaret came with her kids. My father came and sat on a crate at the edge for a while before someone made room for him at the table, and he let them. My mother did not come. My brother did not come. Nobody mentioned either of them, but Margaret squeezed my hand under the table, and that was enough. After everyone left, I stayed down in the cave alone, the way I used to as a girl with a flashlight on an upturned crate. The wheels of Driftless Reserve sat on the old wood shelves Otto built, hundreds of them now, ripening in the dark and the damp and the patience. The smell of the cave, the same smell it had been my whole life, the smell of something becoming itself slowly, because nobody rushed it. I had the make-book with me. I always do now. I opened it to my grandfather's last page, the small slanted handwriting, the misspellings, and then to the page after, where the license was folded, soft at the creases now from being carried. The day they forget you made it is the day you'll need it. He'd known. He'd known his own family better than they knew themselves. And he'd loved me enough to put a thing in writing they couldn't argue with, and then he'd trusted me to carry it until the day I needed it, and to know that day when it came. I put my hand flat on the cool stone of the cave wall, the wall I'd scraped the original cultures from when I was 25, the wall where the whole thing started. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, to the dark, to the wheels, to the man 4 years gone who'd bet everything he had on a granddaughter everyone else called a little science project. I kept it, and I needed it, and I knew. I pulled the chain on the single bulb. The cave went dark. I walked up the stone steps into the cold, clear night, and the creamery sat there in the dark the way it had my whole life, except now the name on the door, and the name on the cheese, and the name on the work were finally, at long last, the same name. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. The people who dismiss what you build are counting on you never reading the fine print of your own worth. They need you to believe your work is a hobby, a phase, a little science project, because the moment you understand exactly what you made, and exactly what it's worth, you stop being someone they can use and start being someone they have to deal with. My grandfather taught me that the difference between a craftsman and an amateur is the willingness to write down your own mistakes where you'll have to see them again. It turns out the same thing is true of your own value. Write it down. Put it somewhere they can't argue with it. And on the day they forget you made it, you'll be ready. That's my story. One cheese, one cave, one agreement two stubborn old men signed in a back room, and a family that finally learned my name belonged on the thing I built. If this reminded you of a time someone took the credit for your work, tell me about it in the comments. I read them. And if you've ever been the one in the milk house while someone else stood in the photo, share this with somebody who needs to hear that the quiet work counts and that the fine print remembers, even when the family forgets. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.